Desi will go. Oh, okay, Desi go.
All right, so you know that I have a lot of theological discussions with people with different theological beliefs. So explain to me why, if the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ, we worry about gluten and alcohol.
We worry about alcohol?
Yeah, like, let's say someone's a recovering alcoholic. Let's say someone has a gluten allergy.
Sure.
Those things don't exist, right? Because it's the body and blood of Christ.
Right. So the understanding is this question has come up before in other situations. So the question, for those of you that did not hear, is we believe, of course, that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ. And what happens in the case of people who are concerned that there is alcohol in the Eucharist, especially those who are maybe recovering alcoholics. So there's two ways to approach this. The one way to approach it is to say, well, if you're concerned, and you know that those of you who come up to receive communion, you're not consuming an entire chalice that has been mixed with water 3 times already, which has really diluted the alcohol. So the concern, and all of you receive just a spoonful, right? You receive a spoonful of the Holy Eucharist. A little bit of alcohol is not going to make someone an alcoholic. Other things have made someone an alcoholic, granted. So that little thing isn't going to make them crave alcohol more. If they come in faith, they're going to crave Christ. So the second way to look at that is to say, truly it is the body and blood of Christ. And if you believe that it is the body and blood of Christ, we also know that Christ's full presence is in the Eucharist. Would Christ want to harm us any further than we've harmed ourselves? So it does become a matter then of faith in that regard. So the two things, so the way we would answer that is a little bit of alcohol, which is in the body and blood of Christ, is not going to make you, is not going to destroy you. And I don't know how organizations like AA or Al-Anon or Alateen and how they usually handle that kind of stuff, but if they're concerned about this, they should be concerned about consuming moonshine and whiskey and over the course of so many years, but such a little amount isn't going to bother anyone. I mean, when we receive the Eucharist, we can taste the wine, there's no question about it. But it's not wine because it's infused with the very presence of Christ, which, if Christ is fully present, how can he allow anything bad to happen to us? That's how
Yeah, right, and that's what that would be my response as well. I've just heard responses, well, it's both, and I've heard the accidents still.
The accidents is a Latinization, which probably you heard from a Roman Catholic.
Right,
Yeah, and the accidents has to do with what it looks like on the outside. In other words, the accidents is that it's bread and wine. And that was used in the term that came up in the Middle Ages with regard to how communion is, how the bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Christ. They used the term transubstantiation, meaning that the accidents remain what they are, but the actual the elements become the body and blood of Christ. We don't use the term transubstantiation, right? We use the term mystical change, or metavolie, where we get the word metabolism. Yeah, that would be my response, if that makes sense.
yeah.
We're on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
Roger.
So I was reading the gospel reading here, and it mentions briefly, and I've read this before, but it just really snapped at me where it mentions being taken up, he was taken up to the third heaven, and I was just wondering what. Yeah.
So in antiquity there was you said the gospel or your epistle reading?
The epistle reading.
The epistle reading, right? The first reading, right? So it talks about how St. Paul was brought up to the third heaven. So that in antiquity, there were the way to understand it was there were kind of layers that the ancients then believed. They didn't understand when we talk about an atmosphere, the stratosphere, the various kinds of scientific designations of the air, above us. They understood things as having kind of tiers, like heaven itself was tiered. So you had basically the first tier, which would be the world, and then the air we breathe. And in the air we breathe, you had the demons who normally would fly around trying to tempt people. Then you had a second designation of another kind of like a second heaven, and then a third heaven, and then a fourth heaven. So the third heaven would be basically the area where the angels themselves would gather. And so when St. Paul says that he was brought up to third heaven, that's simply another way of saying that he had a vision, that he had a particular vision of the divine. We can also say the same thing about the prophet Isaiah, when he had a vision of the heavenly throne of God and the cherubim and the seraphim who surrounded the throne of God and were holding his throne up and were praising God continuously. Just like we say in the hymn of the church, we who mystically image the cherubim. What does that mean? That means that we as a church are brought up to the highest tier of heaven to witness God seated on the throne with all of the angels singing, and we together sing as we wait for the gifts to come out, when the priest comes out with the gifts. So, I don't know if that makes sense,
Yeah.
or so it's a kind of a symbolic way of saying that we are raised up to the highest heaven. But the third heaven was another way of saying that, you know, he's raised pretty high to where the angels themselves begin to inhabit, as it were, the space around him. So, yeah. Another question. Amanda.
For converts coming in who are married in the Orthodox Church, and then they're already previously married, then they become Orthodox, do they, when they want the church to recognize their marriage, do they have a full-on wedding, or do they get a special blessing from the priest? How does that work?
So that's a very good question too. So normally, right, when people have already been married in the church, married outside of the church and converted to the faith, so the idea is that when they enter into the church, it is proper to have their marriage blessed. That doesn't mean to have a full-blown wedding. It just means just to have a ceremony.
Yeah, I don't mean the flowers.
Right.
I just mean the crowns, the candles,
Yep.
the priest, and that's it.
Right, it's to have the marriage sacramentally, sanctioned or blessed by the church. So yes, it is appropriate to do that. Again, remember that with the way the Orthodox Church operates is that, and there's a little bit of an inconsistency here, because when we actually welcome those who were previously who were baptized, let's say in the Presbyterian Church or the Roman Catholic Church, they are accepted into the Orthodox Church just on the basis of chrismation, right? If they're mainstream Protestants or Roman Catholics, they simply are chrismated into the faith. That means that the Orthodox Church accepts the baptism. Now, when I say the Orthodox, I mean the majority of the Orthodox world, because you have the very conservative, ultra-traditionalist Orthodox who don't believe that a baptism in the name of the Trinity, even outside the Orthodox Church, is valid. But the majority of Orthodox churches do accept that if someone has been baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity, that baptism is accepted. And so they are simply chrismated into the faith. So the baptism is accepted, but not another couple's wedding outside of the church. So that's an inconsistency. Why is it that we accept the one thing and not the other? There's a bit of discussion about why that is, but rather than confusing things more, the appropriate practice is eventually to have the family have their marriage, have the marriage between the husband and the wife blessed in the church. This does not mean that they necessarily cannot receive communion up until they have their marriage blessed, because the intention is that they want to have their marriage blessed eventually. So if the intention is there, then of course they can continue to receive communion, because they're not living in sin. I mean, if they have a family especially, they're within the good graces of the church. But it is proper to probably discuss doing to have the marriage blessed. And normally the people that can be the sponsor for that could be the person or the individual or the persons who have welcomed either the husband or the wife into the church. That is most appropriate.
Is the ceremony for that the same as the ceremony?
Yeah, it would be considered the first degree, the marriage in the first degree. So the sacrament of holy matrimony it's not vigamon, it's the actual first marriage ceremony. So, I'm thinking we do have, obviously families in our community who are catechumens, of course, like the Arnolds, of course, and shepherds. So you basically will get the benefit of having being married for the first time, ever, so to speak, in the Orthodox Church. Because the service of the second marriage is considered for both the husband and the wife, if they've already been divorced once previously. It's an altered service. It still has elements of the first marriage, but it's more of a penitential service. But that would not be the case with our catechumen families in our community. So it would be the full first marriage, as if you're getting married for the first time. Just like
this is probably a little deeper question. Would you consider the Orthodox interpretation of the Bible to be a revelation?
the interpretation, yes. Were you here when I did the mini lectures?
I was a little bit, but
Did you come to the session on scripture?
I might have missed that.
Okay, so definitely, absolutely. I mean, the way we kind of look at the scriptures is we have to go beyond the scriptures. What brought the scriptures into existence? Tradition. How the church believed. What the church believes was eventually written down and recorded on parchment. So, in other words, what we have is what the church believed initially, and then what the church decided to basically to record for the sake of, future generations to come. So when we talk about, are the scriptures the result of divine revelation? They are, because the church is an example. The church that gave us the scriptures, because the scriptures didn't just come out of nowhere. They came out of a tradition. They came out of the community itself in Jerusalem. And as it spread, the writings of Paul, the Gospels themselves, all of those were written because there was already a tradition, what we call holy tradition. It pre-existed before the scriptures were written. So they all received divine revelation. It's kind of like saying, well, when Jesus came to the world, was that not divine revelation? If we deny that Jesus was God, then we should deny the church, and at the same time we should deny the scriptures, and then we have nothing. So absolutely. Absolutely. Maybe another question? Come on, one more.
How do I become a member?
How do you become a member?
Yeah, you might want to maybe have to tell me.
Basically, there's what we do is we have catechism courses. What I do is I usually meet, because I live in Pittsburgh. So what I do is I meet with individual families or individuals, and I'll give you books, and you start reading, and then we discuss what you read. We do that once a month, and then when I feel and you feel that you're ready to convert, as it were, to become Orthodox, then we would set up that date, time, and one of the things that is necessary is you need to have someone to sponsor you to come into the church. In other words, you need to have like a godfather or a sponsor. He'd have to become Orthodox first. But that's kind of what's happening, The funny thing here with St. Spyridon is we have, and then the funny thing, it's actually very blessed, is that we have people who have come into the church, people that were already Orthodox sponsor them, which is the way it normally goes. And then the next thing you know is that other people are sponsoring other people. And then this is kind of how the faith grew. And by the way, that's exactly how the early church did things. Families, someone was already a Christian, they were brought in, they were baptized, and then they became sponsors for someone else and other families. That's how the church expanded, because ultimately what it says is, if Christ is important to you and you prove it and you show it, then you become the example for the next person. And then that person becomes an example for the next person. And that's how the church has grown. And that's why the church is the longest standing institution in the history of the world. Why is it that we're still around? And why is it that we're still doing what we're doing? First of all, it's because God is guiding the church. It's not me, it's not humans, it's the grace of God working through humans, imperfect as we are, to do what he's doing. So the church is around, and the church is there, and the church continuously does miracles, especially the Orthodox Church. All of you know that. you know, with the miracles, I mean, when I first came to this community, it's going to be 4 years, I think. I think it already is 4 years. Time flies. I remember meeting, you know, a lot of you. You made me feel so welcomed, and I immediately saw the grace of God working. One of the first things I was told in this community when I came is, we're a smaller community and we're afraid that we're going to all fizzle out and this and that. And, you know, I remember that conversation we had. And something was telling me that, I said, no, this church is going to grow. And it's not that I had anything in mind. I just said it because, not because I wanted to say it, but because I felt that there was something, you know, that this community is going to grow because its heart is in the right place. And then people would come and they would, you know, say, Father, can you pray for me, do this, or, you know, and then I would see miracles happening. Miracles happening. People that were ill all of a sudden get better, you know. God is working. These were just signs. They're like little signs to tell us that God is taking care of us. He's taking care of this community. So all of these miracles that are happening, you know, and if they're happening one after another, you know that we're doing something right. Either that or God is feels very bad for us. And he just keeps giving us miracle after miracle. But I think it's really more that God sees something good. He sees faith. He sees the truth. He sees a concern, a love, a mercy, that everything that we believe we're putting into practice. And that's what's making this community grow. And that's why the church remains the loudest voice against injustice and sin in the world. All of us have to do our part. So, I don't know if that convinced you.
Yeah, you know.
If, or at least help. One last.
Another question. How long is this going on? How long will it take us to keep asking?
Another minute or so, and then I'll have to do announcements.
Do you think the secular view, historic view, when the Gospels were written are accurate? I don't think they are.
It depends what those historical views are.
Well, the dates of when they were written, I think they're.
I mean, your margin of error would be at most a decade, let's say. I mean, for example, the epistles we know are pretty much established that they were written within the first century, at the time of St. Paul, which is when he lived. The epistles predate the synoptic gospels, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, except for maybe Mark, because Mark was written pretty early. And there was a Q source. Are you familiar with the Q source?
I don't know, because I know.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get too deep.
One of Paul's letters to Corinth, he talks about that, like it's an early creed. According to the scriptures, Christ died and rose again. Like it's kind of
Right.
Paul is referencing the scriptures.
Because he lived at the.
existence.
Exactly, because when Paul wrote to the Christians of Corinth, he wrote many letters. We have to remember, not all of them made it into the canon of Scripture that we have. So with the letter of the Corinthians, there were two that made it in, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, right? So when he was writing, he also references in 1 Corinthians the Last Supper. If you recall, I think it's like the 14th or 15th chapter. But what he does is he was living very close to the time. So Jesus, let's say, if we say 33 AD or 36 AD is when Jesus died, rose from the dead, ascended into heaven, established the church. Paul is writing within 10 to 15 years after that, so he already knew of the meetings that Christians were having. He already knew. He had no scriptures in front of him, except the book of Psalms and whatever the Old Testament was. He already knew what the Christians were doing. He knew about the Last Supper, so he was able to reference it. Because in talking with other people, that's why I said tradition predates Scripture. The tradition already existed. So he's talking about these things, so he's able to talk about them because they're so close to his time. If Paul was living in the after 100 AD, the memory might not have been as clear. But in terms of so when they were written, then we have the Gospels that were written from 50 on, let's say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John was written, the book of Revelation, the epistles of John, the 3 universal epistles, and Revelation and the Gospel were written from about 90 to about 105 AD, because it's believed that John was the last of the disciples to die. And so it's towards the end of the
This was probably, the secular view was probably off because they put Mark at 70 AD.
Mhm.
But that's only because of Jesus prophesying that the temple fell in Jerusalem. So that's the only reason they date that way is because they can't think that
Right.
prophecy is possible.
Yeah.
So then they date the rest of them like based off of Mark. So I assumed that they were all wrong because of their assumption that Mark was written after the temple fell, and then someone's pretending that Jesus prophesied. So
Yeah,
that's
and I mean,
why assumed that they were.
yeah, and I mean, those kinds of things, I mean, we do know that all of them were written certainly within the first century. I mean, then we get into kind of mental gymnastics as to like who did what, and those are the kinds of things that don't deny the validity of the Gospels or the validity of the epistles, but they're kind of like more, they tend to create sometimes confusion, and if there are discussions or debates about them, it's because they're trying to debunk their value, and that's certainly not the case. We cannot deny that they were all written by the end of the first century.
I just knew that they're real, like I said, Paul was already referencing the scripture.
Oh, absolutely.
That's why I knew that they were real, because they date Paul before Mark was written, which doesn't make any sense.
No. Mark probably would have been first, but then again, remember that the tradition that all of the gospel writers and Paul are drawing from, there's a tradition that already existed. If that tradition is, if we say that there was no tradition, then that's where the Protestants start getting into all these debates. Because the tradition kind of already says that the truth was there. People were just kind of like, hearing the truth from different people close to the apostles, people close to the disciples, and so forth. So that's why, if you take out tradition completely and you just operate on sola scriptura, which a lot of Protestants do, then things can get really confusing. But there's already a tradition in place. I'll share my notes with you if you want. I'll be happy to share my notes on that segment that you made of this. All right, thank you all very much. Let me just do some quick announcements here.